Okay, this is the start of a lecture that I'm going to give in Brussels.
You might want to change a few things. First of all, I hope to God this isn't the microphone you were planning on using in your lectures, because I had to turn the audio on this all the way up and I can still barely make out what you're saying. Secondly, the labor theory of value is not correct and there is no science or evidence to support it. It has been thoroughly debunked and is proven to be a complete absurdity in every aspect for 150 years.
One of the things that Engels emphasizes is that socialism can only succeed politically and economically if it's based on some sound scientific theory.
And it has been proven through both application and examination of its core theory that it has no basis in reality. I mean, for fuck's sake, Marx's thesis on worker alienation debunks the labor theory of value, because if people cannot see themselves in the objects that they create, then they're not putting value into their labor at all by Marx's own standard. Marx himself debunked Marxist economics. And by the way, things which are scientific don't actively contradict themselves. But then, of course, there's the incentive problem and points which are so rock solid that Marxists can't even bullshit their way through it like they did with the incentive problem by just saying, well, people will work because they will. That, of course, is the E.C.
He wanted to show what the underlying basis was for the class division of society.
Well, that's an easy one. People choose different things to spend their money on. People develop different habits than one another. People associate in different ways. In short, quote-unquote, class division is nothing more than an overcomplicated manner of explaining that people are not the same.
And on this basis, he wanted to show the limitations of reforms that didn't change the fundamental structure of the society.
I just want to point out that even if the labor theory of value was correct, and there was a surplus of value being created by commodities sold, which was then being used by producers as profit, this would still not be exploitation, because to call it so implies that you're inherently entitled to profit produced using property which was created by someone else who worked to get the property to create the commodities. It becomes even more absurd when you actually examine how Marxists argue that it's exploitation, because they claim that profit is theft, as if workers are somehow coerced out of their money on top of being entitled to someone else's property.
How it has been attacked, both from the standpoint of the subjective theory of value and from the standpoint of what's been called the transformation problem.
What evidence do you have that either of those were proposed just to slight the theories of Marx or the labor theory of value? This is something which pisses me off at the far left, almost as an instinctive defense mechanism does every time they're faced with criticism. They frame every dissenter as if they're attacking them and their ideas. The subjective theory of value was theorized at first as a solution to the diamond water paradox, and it also happened to completely debunk the labor theory of value in the process. I find this reasoning to be eerily similar to creationists screeching about evolution and Darwin, which, by the way, to this day, Marxists and other subscribers to the labor theory of value don't have an answer to the paradox of value. As for the transformation problem, that is a direct criticism of the labor theory of value. However, yet again, you have no evidence or reason to suspect that it was a politically motivated attack against Marxist economics.
What does it say, then? At its simplest, it says that the average price of a good will be proportional to the average labour used to make it. And if you look at a whole industry, the value added in an industry will be roughly proportional to the labour that the industry uses. Price quantities, therefore, are seen as the indirect representation of underlying quantities of human time.
And I can think of 5 objections to that right off the top of my head.
It had been almost universally accepted in the early 19th century. The leading economists all believed in it. But by the mid-century, it was being criticised in establishment circles because it was seen as politically risky.
No. The reason that the labor theory of value was rejected is because there were several problems pointed out with it, some of which I've already gone over, and more plausible explanations for value came along which ironed out the flaws which the labor theory of value had. And by the way, how is something both universally accepted but rejected by the political establishment? Now your conspiratorial rambling doesn't even make sense.
And then, by the late 19th century, only socialists still supported it, whereas most orthodox economists had moved to alternative theories from marginalism or subjectivism. And these alternatives remain the orthodoxy that is taught to students in economics to this day.
Well, it's accepted in mainstream academia, however, to say that it's orthodox in teaching is a lie. Most economists in colleges are either Keynesians, post-Keynesians, neo-Keynesians, or Marxists. In fact, every economics professor at some of these more mainstream colleges, such as Harvard, are Marxist. Not only this, but the Communist Manifesto is the 4th most assigned book in all college courses, not just economics.
Let's look at some of the lines of attack that conservative economists have used.
Of course, because literally everyone who's not a Marxist is a conservative. Be honest, does this shit ever work?
On the one hand, they've said that prices, in the end, represent subjective valuations of commodities. On the other hand, when they present a more elaborate theory, they say that where you get a price, it's where you get the intersection between what are termed a supply and a demand curve. Now, in another publication, I go into some detail as to why this doesn't constitute a scientific theory.
What it takes for something to constitute as a scientific theory is to be able to make observations of your theory, formulate a hypothesis, develop testable predictions, and gather data to be able to test these predictions. So I would be interested to see how the subjective theory of value doesn't constitute a scientific theory when it meets all of the criteria for something to constitute a scientific theory.
Basically, it's a matter of Occam's razor, which says you shouldn't multiply entities beyond causes.
Actually, Occam's razor is only the use of generalized formulation to guide in the development of creating theoretical models, and what it suggests is that the model which makes the least amount of assumptions is generally the strongest. Firstly, Occam's razor is not an irrefutable principle in the scientific method. It is merely a preference for simplicity based on the fact that each potential explanation for an occurrence comes with an unrealistically large or even infinite amount of alternative variables. The reason this principle is generally used in testing scientific observations is because any theory can be propped up with ad hoc, unfalsifiable hypotheses when it's failing in explanations to prevent the theory from being falsified. In other words, simpler theories tend to be easier to test under the scientific method. The problem with using Occam's razor here is, first of all, your observation of the theory of value isn't any more or less complicated than the subjective theory of value. In fact, one could argue that the subjective theory of value is even simpler than the labor theory of value. No one here is complicating things, only offering an alternative theory to the one which was proposed by yourself. But also, there are very serious problems with the labor theory of value which supporters of it cannot seem to address, and the subjective theory of value answers for nicely. So it's not that the subjective theory of value is overcomplicating things, it's that you have things to answer for which you can't. So either explain these issues, such as the transformation problem or the paradox of value, or concede that you're incorrect. Ironically, you are the one here who is not abiding by the scientific method.
At any one time, all you can observe is a combination of a certain quantity of goods being sold and their price.
Oh, come on, even you know that's fucking bullshit, because earlier you said this.
At its simplest, it says that the average price of a good will be proportional to the average labour used to make it. And if you look at a whole industry, the value added in an industry will be roughly proportional to the labour that the industry uses.
According to this standard, any economic theory is unscientific. So, which is it? Is the entire science of economics, including Marxism, unscientific? Or are you just appealing to the classic economic illiterate tactic of pulling shit out of your ass and flinging it at the wall in an effort to see what sticks?
If you're going to explain that in terms of two curves...
Wait a minute. Oh my god. He is actually trying to argue that the supply and demand model doesn't exist. There is literally not a single school of economics, including Marxist, which rejects the existence of the supply and demand model. There are only differing explanations for how it works and what influences it. And the reason for this being the case is because they have been proven beyond a reasonable doubt to be correct. That is how producers know how many products to create and to put out on the market.
You're inventing more unknown entities than there are observables.
No, you're just a quasi-intellectual half-wit who doesn't even have the slightest idea of what you're talking about.
Because a curve, even in its simplest form of a straight line, requires at least two constants to define it. If it's not a straight line but has some degree of curvature, you'll require 3, 4, many constants to define it.
The curves represent either shifts in supply or demand, which indicate either an increase or decrease of the supply or demand in the market. Good lord, this isn't even entry level. This is the type of shit you're taught in middle school consumer ec. Why am I even still responding to this retard? I think the point where most rational people would have stopped listening is when he said that he supports the labor theory of value, but everyone who's sentient likely stopped watching the moment that he said he doesn't believe in the supply and demand model.
Now, if you have a series of made up or unknown constants, and there are more unknown constants than observables, then you have a theory which is unfalsifiable.
No, supply and demand is not an unfalsifiable theory. It's objectively demonstrable and has been proven to be correct, so much so that no rational person, or at least no economist, has ever denied it, and no person who's dealing with evidence or observation can deny it. And I know that the topic is the subjective theory of value, but your base for claiming that the subjective theory of value is false is essentially that the entire science of economics is unscientific. God. If this is the shit he's gonna pull when arguing for his theory of value against another, I'm actually kind of scared of what he's going to say regarding the transformation problem.
So you, as a basic principle in a scientific theory, you can't have more unknowns in your model than there are data points.
And you don't understand Occam's razor either. This is a guy who presented this at a major political event. Just to remind you, proving once and for all that mainstream politics are nothing more than a big fucking joke. This is the sort of crap I'd expect Vermin Supreme to pop off with, not someone with a serious ideology.
And the entire supply and demand model demands that you have more unknowns than data points. So it can explain everything and can never be falsified.
No, you fucking idiot. It's not unfalsifiable. It's just right. Not everything that opposes you that you can't refute is unfalsifiable.
The next basis has been to critique the labour theory of value as being inconsistent based on what's called the transformation problem.
What's funny is that the transformation problem is something that Marx himself pointed out. He just failed to give a satisfactory answer to dismiss it in the eyes of some people. So to claim that the transformation problem is a quote-unquote conservative line of attack against Marxism both shows your ignorance on the topic at hand and that you've never actually read Marx despite representing his ideology.
Now, any scientific theory has to be one that makes predictions that can be put to observational test. That's something I was saying in the case of supply and demand theory. It's untestable.
Oh my god, you actually just said that, didn't you? You actually just said that.
If it makes no predictions, it's meaningless. And if it cannot be tested, it's not scientific. If it is testable, and if its predictions are borne out by observation, then the theory should be accepted. Now, how does this apply to the labour theory of value? How would we set about testing it? To verify it, you need information on the money value of the output of lots of industries, and you need information on the labour content of the outputs of these industries. If the money value is closely correlated with the labour content, then the predictions of the labour theory of value have been confirmed. If, on the other hand, they were uncorrelated, then the labour theory of value would clearly be falsified.
Well, again, that's a pretty easy one. Demand is based on marginal utility, value is subjective, as I've explained earlier in greater detail, and profit is determined by how well a commodity performs on the market. Simple answer, labor has absolutely nothing to do with a commodity's value.
How do you get this information? Well, you couldn't have done it 100 years ago. You can do it nowadays, since all countries publish what are called input-output tables for their economies.
There are multiple problems with the I/O chart, but here are the main four. Firstly, in the model of private households and firms both optimize, and somehow they aren't as well off as they can be, which means they leave some obvious gains out. Why don't those households or firms optimize and take into account these external gains? Secondly, why is the government able to recognize the externalities and compensate for them through taxes and subsidies, but private entities who are in question can't? Third, this model doesn't explain the different governments and their effect on the economy in terms of overall influence. And fourth, there is no clear explanation of what the government needs to know in order to affect taxes and subsidies. But even with all these main points aside, the I/O chart has only existed since 1905, while markets have existed as far back as 100,000 years. So if the I/O chart is required to send signals to producers for how much they need to produce and put on the market, how come the market was operating for thousands of years without an I/O chart?
Okay, this is a view of the United Kingdom input-output table.
Find it interesting that you keep switching between different countries arbitrarily. But no, this argument you're making assumes that there's a correlation between labor and value, which there is none, and without that correlation, these numbers are meaningless. This guy is actually so dumb that he's made me tired, so with that, I'm going to end the video, because I'm pretty sure you've seen enough to get the picture. Thank you all for watching. Please comment, rate, subscribe. I will see you all next time.